Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. The long-awaited rule change to Title IX has been finalized. Joining me to talk more about this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, the Department of Education has been working on a couple changes to Title IX. Which one is this?
Yeah, Eliana, that's a great question. This is sort of the confusing thing about the Title IX change is that there's two different ones, right? And this is like the broader Title IX change. And essentially this one is focused on like sort of expanding the definition of sex discrimination to include things like gender identity and pregnancy. So this is like a very broad sort of regulation change that's directed at federally funded schools and colleges, universities, institutions of higher learning to prohibit sex discrimination in all these different kinds of ways. There's a separate rule on transgender athletes that is forthcoming, right? So this one had, I believe, 240,000 comments, and the transgender athlete rule had 150,000 comments. And so that one's a narrower ruling on how should these institutions, both K-12 schools and institutes of higher education, how should they handle transgender students on sports teams, right? So aligning with gender identity and, those teams based on sex, right? And those kinds of provisions of Title IX. So this one, this federal rule is the broader one, and that speaks to all different kinds of gender identity and discrimination and sort of expands the scope of Title IX to include gender identity and has like a lot of more protections for pregnant students, but it doesn't really get into some of that athlete stuff. That's a separate one. So that's forthcoming. So that's very controversial as well. But a lot of people have spoken out about this broader look. And as I mentioned in my piece, this one is 1,577 pages long. So there's a lot of stuff to look at.
And part of the delay on this rule change was the process of going through comments in response to the proposed rulemaking. This is kind of part of the process whenever they're making a rule change like this. Can you walk us through a little bit who submitted comments, what sorts of concerns did they raise, and did the final rules address those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot of different kinds of people who wrote in public comment. So anybody could have written in a comment. A lot of the comments, are coming from people who have a vested interest. Maybe they were somebody who identifies as a sexual minority, and they were saying like, look, this was my experience. I was bullied because I was gay, or because of, I'm a different sexual minority person. I'm a LGBTQ plus. And this is my experience. And I want you to know, this would have helped me, and so there were some of those personal stories that the education department received. Then there's critics of how is this going to impact women or students who are uncomfortable with transgender students in these bathrooms, and those kinds of potential critics of the rulemaking. So there's a lot of different kinds of legal centers, or different kinds of advocacy organizations that are weighing in on this and saying, this is what we say, or we approve of this, or we would like these different protections, or they don't go far enough. And 240,000 comments in response to this one that was recently finalized, right? That's a massive number, and a lot were, for these, a lot were against these. And so, yes, the education department had to sift through those and respond to each kind of comment. So I'm sure that there was a lot of overlap in some of those and different concerns about every. That's why the document's 1,500 pages long, is because they do go through, and that applies to definitions of words, that applies to the specific wording, and they do make changes based on some of these concerns. So there were concerns raised about maybe how the specific language or the specific wording would implement the procedure, right? And so they would move some things around, or they would cut things. So there was some responsiveness to that, and what I've seen with gender, adding gender to sex discrimination, which is, one of the criticisms from some of these critical organizations, basically they're saying adding gender to sex discrimination is basically rewriting Title IX, this 50-year-old law, and you're, broadening it past what Congress would allow. And so I don't think that the education department, I don't think they made any big changes based on that, but they have to say we've seen that, but we do think we have the authority to do that. And, the Independent Women's Forum, one of those critical organizations, they have said, we're planning on suing, right? So that I think kind of can lay the groundwork, like this is what the Department of Education said it was going to do. This is what we said. This is what they said. Now we're suing. So now the courts have to decide like who's got the legal ground, right? So I think it can lay the groundwork for, some of these lawsuits that different organizations have said, because you can see like these are specific concerns. This is how this is what the department said. This is why it's not legal. You know what I mean? So I think that is some of the response there in short.
And since the changes were finalized, X, formerly Twitter, has seen comments from both current Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona, as well as former Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos. What are their perspectives on this?
Yeah, they're worlds apart, right? So Betsy DeVos, former education secretary, she said that the Biden administration's radical rewrite, and I'm quoting here, rewrite of Title IX guts the half-century of protections and opportunities for women and callously replaces them with radical gender theory as Biden's far-left political base demanded. So that's that's her perspective on that. And she also said, this regulation is an assault on women and girls. It makes it a federal requirement that boys be allowed in girls' bathrooms in elementary schools. And she also criticized it for making it a federal requirement that feelings and not facts dictate how Title IX is enforced. So kind of this emphasis on, how students are feeling instead of maybe some of these immutable characteristics. And Secretary Cardona had, just a completely opposite response, right? Where he said, look, this advances the promise that no person should experience sex discrimination, sex-based harassment, or sexual violence in federally funded education. So for Cardona, for the Biden administration, this is a huge win, right? Because they're saying, look, it doesn't matter if you are LGBTQ plus, like nobody should have any kind of sex discrimination. And that includes gender identity. That's what they're saying is like, this is, like you should not face a hostile environment at a federally funded institution, whether if it's a public university or, if it's any kind of K-12 school, you should not be bullied because of your sexuality or your gender identity. And so they're seeing this as like it's building on the legacy of Title IX, which has opened doors for women for 50 years. So that was like Cardona's statement there is, we're continuing the work of Title IX and that we have the authority to do so.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Do you care about classroom curriculum, transparency policies, and how your taxpayer dollars are invested in education, but you find it hard to cut through the partisan noise? Chalkboard News is bringing you straight news reporting on public K-12 education. We're talking news without spin. Chalkboard News publishes fact-based stories that make sense to parents, teachers, and readers who have skin in the game. Get this news delivered to your inbox for free by signing up at chalkboardnews.com. Subscribe today at chalkboardnews.com.